Have you ever seen a house that felt alive? Not just walls, not just paint, but something magical? This isn't just a story about bricks, wood, and plaster. No, this is a story about a woman, her dreams, her art, and a house that became so much more than shelter. But before we dive deep, let me ask you this. What would you do if the one place you poured your entire soul into was suddenly ripped away from you? Would you fight for it? Would you walk away? Or would you leave behind a final surprise that nobody saw coming? Stick with me, because by the end of this story, you'll see why one seemingly ordinary cottage became a legend in our neighborhood. Oh, and before we begin, if you love mysterious, emotional, and thought-provoking true stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one because the ending? Let's just say it left everyone speechless. Now, let's start at the beginning. Madison Clark wasn't your typical retiree. She was in her early 60s, but her energy, her laugh, and her paint-stained hands made her feel timeless. She used to be an art teacher back in the 80s, the kind of teacher who made kids believe they could paint entire worlds. Later, she opened one of those paint and wine businesses that became the thing in town. She made good money, but more importantly, she built memories. And Madison's house? Well, it wasn't just a house. It was a canvas. From the outside, it looked like a quaint little cottage. Nothing too special. A few bushes, a soft cream facade, and windows that glowed warmly at night. But inside, that's where the magic lived. Every wall was hand-painted with murals. One room was an entire Beauty and the Beast ballroom. Another had an underwater Little Mermaid scene. The hallway? A forest straight out of Snow White. Walking through Madison's home felt like stepping inside a living storybook. And people in the neighborhood? They adored her. She was sweet, always kind, even when she scolded folks about speeding down the road. Everyone respected her. Everyone loved her. But here's the twist. Madison didn't actually own the house. She had an agreement with the old landlord. He loved her murals, promised her she'd eventually get the home, and since she'd been living there since the mid-80s, she never worried. After all, why would she? Until he passed away. And that's where everything started to unravel. When the landlord's kids inherited the property, they didn't see Madison's murals as art. They saw them as a problem. And one of the sons, after visiting the home with his daughter, decided he wanted it for her. No lease. No paperwork. No protection. Madison was suddenly standing on the edge of losing everything she had built for nearly 40 years. But here's the thing about Madison. She wasn't someone who gave up easily. And what she did in her final days inside that house, well, let's just say, it left the new owners with a surprise they never expected. And that's where our story truly begins. The House of Dreams. If you grew up in a small American neighborhood, you know how quickly houses gain reputations. Some are known for their perfect lawns, others for their peeling paint and squeaky gates. But then there are rare ones, houses that feel almost alive. In our neighborhood, that house belonged to Madison Clark. Now, Madison wasn't just some woman with a taste for fancy decor. She was an artist in every sense of the word. Even before you met her, you could sense her presence through her home. The moment you stepped inside, the world outside disappeared. The air smelled faintly of paint and lavender, the kind of scent that instantly wrapped around you like a storybook. The living room wall wasn't painted beige or cream like every other suburban home. No, Madison had turned it into an enchanted ballroom, inspired by Beauty and the Beast. You could almost hear the music if you stared long enough. The hallway carried you through a dark, misty forest with painted trees arching above your head, branches brushing against each other as if whispering secrets. And in the kitchen, bright underwater blues and greens wrapped around you, with Ariel and her friends swimming across the walls. Every single room was a chapter of a fairy tale. And this wasn't amateur art, either. Madison's hand was steady, her details so rich that kids would run their fingers across the walls to make sure the characters weren't actually real. The neighborhood children loved it. Her house was a magical stop during Halloween, and parents often joked about needing tickets just to step inside. But what made her so beloved was her kindness. If you were new to the neighborhood, Madison was the first to bring cookies. If you were struggling, she'd paint you something small, maybe a flower, maybe your pet, to brighten your day. She had this natural way of making you feel seen. Sure, she had her moments of irritation, like when teenagers blasted music too late at night, or when trucks roared past her house too fast. But even then, she handled it with grace. A soft word here, a gentle reminder there. Over time, even the rowdiest neighbors couldn't help but like her. But here's the part that made her story unique. Madison didn't own this house. She'd been living in it since the mid-80s, renting from an older man who had adored her work. In fact, he loved the murals so much that he made her a promise. One day, this house would be hers. It wasn't in writing, just a verbal understanding between two people who respected each other deeply. He told her, "Madison, you've turned this place into something more than a house. When the time comes, I'll make sure it belongs to you." And Madison believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was kind, generous, and he had never once complained about her painting. For decades, that promise hung in the air like an invisible safety net. Madison never worried about losing her home. So she kept painting. She kept creating. She lived her life inside those walls as though they would always be hers. But life has a cruel way of shifting when you least expect it. One quiet autumn morning, the neighborhood woke up to the news. The old landlord had passed away. Madison, who had been close to him for so long, was devastated. She mourned him not just as her landlord, but as a friend. And in the middle of that grief, another thought began creeping in, one she had pushed away for years. What happens now? His children, most of whom Madison barely knew, inherited the house. They weren't like their father. They hadn't grown up with Madison's murals, hadn't watched her transform those blank walls into magic. To them, the house was nothing more than an asset, a property, a number on paper. And though Madison didn't want to admit it yet, her entire world was about to be shaken. At first, things were quiet. The children didn't rush in, didn't immediately make changes. Madison continued living her life, painting commissions, decorating furniture, occasionally hosting small art nights for friends. But the silence felt heavy. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it was only a matter of time before the new owners came calling. And when they did, it wouldn't be with promises. It would be with paperwork. It would be with power. And Madison, despite all her strength, was standing on the edge of losing the house of dreams she had built for nearly 40 years. The neighbors whispered. They worried. They couldn't imagine Madison living anywhere else. But as much as they hoped, deep down, everyone knew the truth. When ownership changes hands, kindness often fades. The fairy tale was starting to crack. And Madison, though she didn't know it yet, was about to face the hardest chapter of her life. Promises broken. The first knock on Madison's door came just 2 weeks after the funeral. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels sharper than usual, and the world seems quieter, almost waiting. Madison was in her studio, a mug of tea cooling beside her, when she heard the sound. 3 short knocks. Firm. Businesslike. When she opened the door, a tall man in his late 40s stood on the porch. He wore a dark jacket, a neatly pressed shirt, and an expression that said he wasn't here for small talk. Beside him stood a girl, maybe in her early 20s, with wide eyes that seemed to drink in every detail of the house. "Mrs. Clark?" the man asked, his tone polite but cold. "Yes," Madison replied cautiously. "And you are?" "Daniel. I'm Robert's son. This is my daughter, Emily." Her heart sank. She had expected this moment, dreaded it even, but now that it was here, she wasn't ready. Still, she forced a smile. "Of course. Please come in." The moment Emily stepped inside, her face lit up like a child walking into Disneyland for the first time. She gasped at the murals. Ariel swimming across the kitchen wall, Belle twirling in the ballroom, Snow White's forest curling along the hallway. "Dad," she whispered, tugging his sleeve. "It's incredible." But Daniel's expression didn't change. He scanned the walls not with awe, but with calculation, as if he were appraising a piece of property rather than stepping into a home filled with 4 decades of art. They made small talk at first. Daniel asked how long Madison had lived there, what she did for work, whether she lived alone. His questions weren't cruel, but they carried the weight of someone trying to establish control. Emily, meanwhile, wandered from room to room, snapping pictures on her phone, her smile growing wider with each discovery. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mrs. Clark, my father always spoke highly of you. We appreciate the care you've taken with this house." Madison felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. But then came the sentence she'd been dreading. "That said, there are some matters we need to discuss about the property's future." Her hands tightened around the mug she was holding. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Daniel glanced at Emily, then back at Madison. "My daughter has taken quite a liking to this place. We think it would be a wonderful first home for her. She's recently graduated, and she's been looking for something unique. This house is unique." Unique. The word felt like an insult, and a compliment rolled into one. Madison's throat tightened. "But your father and I," he promised. Daniel raised a hand. "I understand there was some kind of verbal arrangement. Unfortunately, nothing was ever put in writing. Legally, that means the property is ours to manage as we see fit." The words hit her like cold water. She had known this was possible. She had told herself for years that she should insist on paperwork, on signatures, on something concrete. But she had trusted Robert, trusted his word, trusted that promises still meant something. And now, she was standing on the edge of losing everything. Emily's voice broke through the silence. "Dad, can I have this room for a studio? The light in here is perfect." Madison turned to see the girl pointing at her studio. Her sacred space. The room where she painted late into the night, where the scent of turpentine and acrylic lingered, where unfinished canvases leaned against the wall like old friends. Her chest ached. Daniel nodded. "We'll figure it out." The conversation ended with polite words and empty reassurances. "We'll be in touch soon. We'll work something out." But Madison could hear the finality in his tone. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a decision. When the door closed behind them, Madison stood in the silence of her living room, staring at Belle on the wall. For the first time, the ballroom felt less magical. The colors seemed muted, the joy drained. That night, she barely slept. Memories of Robert came back, his warm laugh, his genuine appreciation for her work, the way he had always called her murals living treasures. He had promised her safety. He had promised her this house. And now his children were about to strip it all away. Over the next few weeks, letters started arriving. Legal letters. Notices. Cold, printed words that made her stomach twist. She had no lease, no legal right to stay. The murals that had once been her pride were now labeled property damage by the family's lawyer. It was cruel irony. The very thing that made her home magical was now being used as the weapon to drive her out. Neighbors rallied around her. Some offered to start a petition. Others suggested contacting the local news. But Madison, exhausted and heartbroken, knew the truth. The law wasn't on her side. She began quietly packing small things, a stack of books here, a box of brushes there. Every time she sealed a box, it felt like sealing away a piece of her soul. One evening, as she stood in the hallway tracing the painted branches of her forest mural, she whispered, "I thought I'd grow old here." Her voice cracked. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of her fight. Because while she couldn't save the house, she could decide how to leave it. And Madison Clark wasn't the type of woman to walk away without leaving her mark. The last goodbye. The day Madison finally admitted defeat, the sky matched her mood, gray, heavy, and ready to spill rain. She had fought quietly for weeks, writing letters, making calls, even speaking to a lawyer who only confirmed what she already knew. Without a lease, she had no legal footing. Robert's promises, heartfelt though they were, held no weight in a courtroom. And so, with trembling hands, she signed the papers acknowledging she would vacate the property. A move-out date was set. Her heart shattered. This was the house she'd built her life in, the place she'd painted her dreams into every wall. Each brushstroke was a memory, each mural a piece of her spirit. And now strangers would own it. Strangers who didn't see magic, only money. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People stopped by with hugs, baked goods, and offers of help. Some came with tears in their eyes, unable to imagine their block without Madison and her whimsical cottage. Children clung to her legs, asking, "Where will Ariel go? What about Belle?" Madison smiled through the ache in her chest, telling them, "Don't worry. They'll live on in your imagination." But inside, she wondered, was imagination enough to replace what she was losing? Packing was slow, not because Madison owned much, but because every item carried weight. Her paintbrushes, stained with years of color. The easel where she had taught neighborhood kids how to paint sunflowers. Even the chipped mug she always filled with tea while she worked. Each box sealed was another goodbye. One afternoon, her neighbor and longtime friend, Brian, stopped by. He was a handyman, always tinkering with tools and projects, and he had a soft spot for Madison. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "If you want, I can help get the house back into shape before you leave. Sand down the walls, repaint, clean things up. Might make it easier for you to close this chapter." Madison blinked at him. "Why would you do that?" Brian shrugged. "Honestly, I've been meaning to practice with one of those new paint sprayers. This is a chance for me to learn. Besides," he gave her a small smile, "it'll help me pretend this isn't breaking my heart too." At first, Madison resisted. The thought of painting over her murals felt like destroying her soul with her own hands. But Brian persisted. He explained how he'd use it as training, how another friend of his, a landscaper, could fix up the yard. And slowly, Madison realized maybe there was a certain poetry in it. If she couldn't keep her house, maybe she could at least decide how it looked when she left. She wouldn't let the new owners profit from the fairy tales she had poured into those walls. "All right," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do it. But only after everything's out." Brian nodded, his expression firm. "Consider it done." The next week was a blur of moving trucks and storage units. Madison didn't have a huge family, but friends came in droves to help. They lifted furniture, packed dishes, and carefully carried out her paintings. Each time a mural peeked through the open door, neighbors paused, snapping last photos as though capturing memories before they were erased. Madison herself stayed mostly quiet, drifting from room to room like a ghost in her own home. In her studio, she sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the half-finished mural she hadn't gotten around to completing. It was supposed to be a new forest scene, filled with hidden animals peeking through the leaves. She had planned it for years, but life had gotten in the way. Now it would remain unfinished. On her final night in the house, Madison stood in the living room with nothing but bare floors and painted walls around her. The furniture was gone, the shelves empty, the windows bare. Only the murals remained, watching her silently. She ran her hand across Belle's painted gown one last time. "Goodbye, darling," she whispered. Her voice cracked, tears sliding down her cheeks. She moved from wall to wall, murmuring farewells like old friends leaving each other at a train station. When she reached the hallway forest, she leaned her forehead against the painted bark of a tree. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping me company all these years." And then she walked out. Her car was already loaded with a few personal items she hadn't put in storage: paints, brushes, and a suitcase. Brian was waiting outside, arms folded. He didn't speak. He just nodded as Madison locked the door for the last time. "Come on," he said gently. "Guest house is ready. You'll be comfortable there." Madison offered a small, tearful smile. Brian had insisted she stay in his guest house rent-free until she figured things out. The only thing he asked in return was a mural on his living room wall. Madison agreed, though the thought of painting again so soon felt impossible. Still, she followed him, leaving the cottage behind. By the end of that week, the house was empty. Stripped of furniture, stripped of Madison's presence, it stood waiting for its next chapter. And that's when Brian and his team arrived. Sanders buzzed against the walls, tearing down decades of color. Dust hung in the air as Ariel, Belle, and Snow White vanished under rough strokes. What had once been a world of magic quickly dissolved into smudges and blotches, colors bleeding into nothingness. Madison didn't watch. She couldn't. Instead, she sat in Brian's guest house, staring at blank canvases. Part of her felt hollow, like she had left pieces of herself back in those walls. But another part of her, quieter, deeper, was waiting. Because though she had walked away, she hadn't really left. Not entirely. And soon, the new owners would find that out for themselves. Erasing the Magic, rewritten. The first day of the renovation felt like a funeral. Not the kind with flowers and hymns, but the kind where silence presses against your chest and every sound feels out of place. Madison's house, once alive with color, laughter, and the scrape of brushes, was suddenly filled with the harsh whine of machines. Brian and his helpers moved in with buckets, tools, and an excitement Madison could not share. To them, this was a project, a challenge, maybe even fun. To her, it was heartbreak. They started in the living room. Madison had poured herself into that space years ago, turning it into the enchanted ballroom from Beauty and the Beast. She remembered standing on a ladder, brush in hand, carefully painting Belle's golden gown so it shimmered in the light. It had taken weeks of layering, but it was worth it. Neighbors used to gasp when they saw it for the first time. Children twirled in the room, pretending they were dancing too. Now, the sound of Sanders chewed through her work in minutes. The graceful ballroom blurred into blotches of dust, Belle's face fading into nothing. By the end of the morning, she was gone. Madison couldn't watch for long. She sat in the kitchen, nursing a cold cup of tea as the same fate swallowed Ariel's underwater grotto. The bright swirls of turquoise, the little fish she'd painted to dart through the waves, all erased beneath buzzing Sanders. The kitchen smelled of sawdust and paint dust, thick and suffocating. By afternoon, Snow White's forest was stripped bare. The branches that once stretched overhead, creating a canopy of green, were reduced to dull streaks. The forest animals, hidden deer, playful rabbits, a sly fox, were scraped away without a thought. The house that once told stories now told none. When the sanding was finished, Brian brought out his prize, a shiny new paint sprayer he'd been dying to try. He masked off the trim and outlets with careful precision, humming to himself as if he wasn't burying decades of love beneath layers of plastic. "Watch this," he said proudly, pressing the trigger. A hiss filled the air as thick, white primer coated the walls. The last traces of Madison's murals vanished under sweeping strokes. The house no longer looked magical. It didn't even look ordinary. It looked sterile, cold, dead. But Brian wasn't done. He swapped out the primer for what he called his Rebecca colors, the bland palette favored by house flippers everywhere. Semi-gloss white for the walls, charcoal gray for the trim, muted tones that drained even the light from the windows. As he sprayed, the rooms grew heavy with sameness. The ballroom disappeared into stark white. The underwater kitchen transformed into a dull gray box. The forest hallway, once a path of wonder, shrunk into a tunnel of lifeless paint. It was efficient, modern, marketable. It was also joyless. When Madison stepped inside days later to collect a box she had forgotten, the shock nearly knocked the air from her lungs. This was not her house. The murals were gone. The warmth was gone. Even the smell had changed, from lavender and acrylics to chemicals and latex. She stood in the middle of her old living room, staring at the blank white walls. The room didn't feel bigger or brighter as people often claimed of freshly painted spaces. It felt hollow, as though someone had scooped out its soul. "It looks clean," Brian offered, almost apologetically. "Neutral. You know what buyers want." Madison's lips trembled, but she forced herself to nod. "Neutral," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. It felt wrong in her mouth. She placed her hand against the wall where Belle's gown had once flowed. The surface was smooth now, glossy and cold. She shivered and pulled her hand away. Brian didn't notice. He was too busy admiring the evenness of his work, the efficiency of his new sprayer. To him, this was progress. To Madison, it was erasure. She left quickly, muttering an excuse about needing to rest. But as she walked out, she glanced back at the house. For just a moment, maybe a trick of the light, maybe her tired imagination, she thought she saw a faint shimmer beneath the white, as though something was still hiding under the paint. She said nothing. The next stage came outside. Madison had loved the cottage facade Robert once built for her. Curved beams, climbing vines, painted shutters, it gave the home its storybook charm. Children used to call it the fairy tale house. Now, the landscaper Brian hired ripped it all away. The vines were yanked out, roots snapping like bones. The shutters were unscrewed and stacked in a pile. The beams were pried off one by one. What remained was a bare, flat front that looked like every other house on the block. The landscaper dumped gravel where gardens had been, scattering sand and dropping a single boulder in the yard like an afterthought. When neighbors walked past, they slowed down, frowning. Some shook their heads. Looks like a rental now. Can you believe they stripped it like that? Doesn't even look like the same place. It didn't just look different. It felt different. One neighbor who peeked inside swore the air was heavier, that the house didn't want people in it anymore. Another whispered that she heard faint laughter, like children playing, even though the rooms were empty. Even Brian admitted privately to Madison that something about the house felt off. It's weird, he confessed one evening. I know it's just paint, but it feels colder now. Like it's grieving. Madison only gave him a small, knowing smile.
She didn't argue.
She didn't explain. Because deep down, she understood what he didn't. You can sand a wall. You can bury a mural. You can paint over colors until nothing shows. But you can't erase love. You can't erase memory. And sometimes you can erase art. Not completely. The new owners thought they'd stripped the house bare, ready to make it theirs. But Madison knew the truth. The house wasn't empty.
Not yet.
And soon, someone else would find out exactly what she meant. The empty shell. When the last brushstroke of white paint dried, the house was no longer the place it used to be. From the outside, it looked fresh, modern, and ready for new buyers. The cottage-style facade had been torn away, the landscaping stripped bare. What remained was a blank, gray and white box that could have been copied straight out of any real estate brochure. But inside it felt wrong. Not just empty, wrong. The air carried a kind of heaviness, the sort of silence that makes you instinctively whisper, even when you're the only one in the room. The house had lost its warmth, its laughter, its colors, but it hadn't lost its presence. Brian noticed it first. One evening, after finishing the last coat of paint, he stood in the hallway where a mural of the Little Mermaid once spread across the wall. You ever get the feeling you're not really alone in here? He asked, half joking. Madison didn't answer right away. She only ran her fingers along the new white wall, her eyes distant. Finally, she whispered, "That's because you're not." When the realtor came, she smiled brightly at the renovations, complimenting Brian's hard work. "This is perfect. Move-in ready, clean, neutral. Buyers are going to love it." But the first open house told a different story. Couples stepped inside with excitement, their voices carrying through the hall. They admired the updates, the open spaces. Yet the longer they stayed, the quieter they grew. Their footsteps quickened as if they couldn't wait to leave. One woman paused in the living room, staring at the wall. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to her husband. "Hear what?" he asked. She shook her head quickly, refusing to say more. Minutes later, they were gone. The realtor brushed it off as nerves. But the same thing happened again and again. Families walked in smiling, and walked out unsettled. Neighbors started noticing things too. At night, some swore they saw faint lights flickering in the windows even though the power had been shut off. Others claimed they heard faint music drifting from the empty house, soft, whimsical notes, like the opening of a fairy tale. And then there were the roses. Madison had once planted them outside the living room window, right where Belle's ballroom mural had been painted. Brian's landscaper had ripped them out, tossed them aside like weeds. But somehow, weeks later, neighbors said the smell of roses still lingered in the air whenever the wind shifted. "You can scrub the walls," Madison said softly, standing outside one night, but you can't erase everything. The second open house was worse. A young family came to tour the property with their 2 kids. The children ran upstairs while their parents spoke to the realtor. Minutes later, the girl hurried down, clinging to her mother's arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "What's wrong, sweetie?" her mother asked. The girl whispered, "I don't like it up there." Her brother followed slowly, his steps dragging, his face strangely blank. When his father asked what he'd been doing, the boy's voice was flat. "I was talking to the princess." The room fell silent. "What princess?" his mom asked carefully. "The one in the yellow dress," he said, pointing toward the upstairs hallway. "She told me not to let them paint her again." The parents laughed nervously, thanked the realtor, and left as quickly as they could. Madison, watching from across the street, smiled. Weeks passed. The house stayed empty. Realtors grew frustrated. Buyers kept coming, but none stayed long. Something about the place repelled them. Not the walls, not the floors, but the feeling. Brian paced angrily one afternoon. "This makes no sense. The house is perfect. It's updated, modern, priced right. Why doesn't anyone want it?" Madison looked at him calmly, her eyes steady. "Because it's not yours to sell," she said. He frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" But Madison didn't explain. Because deep down, she knew what he would never understand. You can sand down the murals. You can paint over the magic. You can strip away the charm. But you can't kill the spirit of a house that was born from love, art, and dreams. And this house, her house, wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The house remembers. The house sat quietly at the end of the street, its freshly painted white and gray walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. From the outside, it looked neat, sterile, and completely ordinary, just another flip ready for its next owner. But anyone who stepped inside could feel it immediately. It wasn't ordinary. The house remembered. Every brushstroke Madison had ever made lingered in the air, invisible but persistent. Every wall, every corner, every hallway held fragments of the magic she had poured into it. And though Brian had tried to erase it with paint, sanders, and sprayers, the house refused to forget. The daughter, Emily, was the first to notice. She had begged her father for the house for months, enchanted by stories of its murals. She imagined walking through the living room, seeing Belle twirl, watching Ariel swim in her underwater grotto, and hearing Snow White's forest animals rustling softly in the trees. But as she stepped through the front door for the first time, her fantasy crumbled. The murals were gone. The walls were gray and white. The living room, once full of magic, now felt like a blank, sterile box. "No, this isn't the same house," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her father, trying to be reassuring, said, "It's just different. You'll get used to it." But Emily didn't believe him. She ran upstairs, desperate to find the murals she had dreamed about. The hallway, once a glowing forest, stretched in dull white emptiness before her. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then she heard it, a soft giggle. Her eyes widened. She spun around, but the hall was empty. Only the walls stared back, cold and flat. I know you're here," she whispered. The house seemed to respond with a shiver. Somewhere deep inside, a faint shimmer of color appeared on the wall. Not much, but enough. A shadow of Belle's golden gown? The faintest swirl of Ariel's turquoise hair? Emily couldn't be sure, but it was enough to make her heart race. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in her new bedroom, staring at the plain white walls, and listened. At first, it was silence. Then came a faint melody, almost like a lullaby. It drifted down the hallway, soft and almost imperceptible. The notes were faint but clear enough to make her shiver. It wasn't coming from outside or from a device. It was inside the house. She bolted upright.
"Mom."
"Dad," she screamed, but only her father, sleeping soundly in the next room, heard her faintly and muttered something about bad dreams. Emily climbed out of bed and crept down the hallway. The notes grew slightly louder as she approached the living room. The walls seemed to hum with a soft energy. Faint outlines of color, swirls, shapes, and shadows wavered beneath the paint. "They're alive," she breathed. Her father would have laughed if he had seen it. But she could see it. She could feel it. The house remembered Madison's magic, and it was trying to reach her. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began whispering again. Neighbors reported seeing lights flicker in the empty house at night. Some swore they heard faint laughter, soft, childlike, and playful, even though the house appeared empty. A few brave souls said they could smell roses drifting through the air where no plants had been planted. Brian, who had poured so much effort into modernizing the house, visited one evening to check the progress. He stood in the living room, brushing dust off his hands, and muttered, "I don't get it. Why does it feel so alive in here?" Madison's voice answered him in his mind, "Because you didn't erase it." Emily began exploring more boldly. She wandered into the kitchen, where once Ariel had swum through bright blues and aquamarine waves. Now, only flat gray walls remained, but she could see faint ripples of color if she looked just right. Tiny movements, like shadows of fish darting through water. The girl didn't scream. She smiled. She understood. The house was telling her a story hidden beneath the layers of paint, waiting for someone who could see it.
Days passed.
The father tried to host a small gathering to show off the house. Friends came, stepping cautiously over the gravel in the yard. They admired the clean lines, the modern floors. But when they stepped inside, everything changed. The air felt heavier. The walls seemed to shift subtly. One child giggled at the living room wall, pointing excitedly. "Look, she's dancing." The adults laughed nervously.
Who?
The child's eyes widened.
Belle.
The princess. No one else could see her, but they felt the unease. Even grown adults found themselves glancing over their shoulders, whispering excuses to leave early. By the end of the night, everyone had left. The house stood in perfect silence again, but it was alive with memory. Madison watched from across the street, hidden behind the branches of a maple tree. She had come to see the house one last time. It was hers, in a way no one else would ever understand. She smiled as she saw Emily laughing at a mural only she could perceive. The magic wasn't gone. Not even close. The house remembered. The walls remembered. The colors, the stories, the dreams, they were all still there, waiting. And Madison knew this. No amount of paint, no matter how modern or neutral, could erase the soul of a home built with love and imagination. Some houses hold memories. Some houses hold spirits. This house held both. And it would not let anyone forget it. The fairy tale was not over. It had only changed readers. And that's the story of Madison Clark, the woman who turned a house into a fairy tale, only to have it stripped bare, and yet, somehow, she still won. Because here's the truth, walls can be painted over, but memories? Memories never fade. So tell me, if you were in Madison's shoes, would you have left quietly? Or would you have left a surprise for the new owners, too? Let me know in the comments. And if you love the story, don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and share, because there's so many more stories waiting for you here.